it has a spiritual, duty, as it were.
And isn't that interesting that as we're pondering these things, they're actually coming into being?
Yeah.
This is a group consciousness. We're all coming into that consciousness anyway.
Yeah.
My path is different from so many people that I talk to, and yet we are coming to that. There is a kind of convergent point of view about human consciousness and an expansion.
What I loved, I also was a member for a while of the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California. Willis Harman and Edgar Mitchell and people, the Apollo astronaut.
Well, can you tell me more about that?
Well, they set up this institute in California to study what they call the noetic sciences. So if we have the noosphere, which is Aristotle's phrase for intellect is the nous, or the nous, which is the immortal part of the human being, according to Aristotle's philosophy. And so this concept of the noetic sciences studies that intellectual or spiritual side of human nature. I personally, as a philosopher, came to the position, like Ken Wilber, that spirituality, which is anti-intellectual, is not what's needed at the moment on the planet. I respect Western science, mathematics and physics, and the hard intellectual edge of the Enlightenment. But I do think that it has to then go further, extend beyond itself, and study the noetic sciences, the spiritual transpersonal fields of experience. And that institute in California is one of the few places on the planet that does that.
Right, because I think generally the scientific atmosphere with questions like this is that it's hard to find a baseline to come from. It's hard to find a control group because these are such subjective experiences. And even people's experience of enlightenment is often so different and arrived at such different ways. It's kind of hard. It's one thing if we are studying people who have lost fingers, or were born without fingers, how they function. But because you can make a judgment about that, you can make a scale of. But in terms of enlightenment or experiences that speak to you spiritually, it's kind of hard to pin down. There's not really a language for it. We all agree when we've had these experiences that they're common, but people who hadn't had these experiences before, they have no baseline from which to.
It's often hard to bridge that discourse. Yeah, right. I came across in the 80s when I was in London, founding this Philosophers of Peace group around the time you were doing your conference in California. I did a course of study in transpersonal psychology, which was just developing as a field of knowledge. And in fact, transpersonal psychology is the branch of psychology that takes these peak experiences seriously, with Abraham Maslow, and it goes back to Carl Jung, who was a psychologist, depth psychologist, said that we have to take account of people's spiritual lives and study them scientifically. So I think ever since Jung and the Jungians realised that, in other words, not all spiritual experience is pathological. It's a sign of healthiness. And Abraham Maslow said we should be studying the psychology of well-being and maximum health. So what is a peak experience? We all feel good when we have happiness moments. So why don't we study those moments of happiness? If we're trying to create a wellness and a well-being on this planet, surely psychology should be studying that. So that's where I kind of started as a young academic. And then that's what I later did as a PhD. I looked at the notion of transpersonal history. But that leads me to another of my questions anyway. I'm not sure if I answered yours fully.
Well, that's a good start.
Yeah, which is, I'm fascinated by the fact that you knew John Lilly, because he was one of the heroes I heard of, in the 70s, and read his Centre of the Cyclone and all that. Tell me about John Lilly and your friendship with him.
Well, my relationship to John Lilly is pure synchronicity.
Right, like all the best things.
Yeah, I hardly knew who he was or what he'd done or anything about him when I met him. But all these various things started coming into my life in certain ways. Like I was actually drawn to California through a conversation I'd had with Timothy Leary in their late 70s. And and he sort of became a bit of a white rabbit in my life.
Timothy Leary?
Timothy Leary. And I would have an experience with him that wasn't very deep or profound, except that it would launch me kind of in a new direction. And for instance, as I was in college and I had been studying meditation, I've been meditating, and And I actually went to hear him speak because I kind of thought it might be just entertaining. And instead what I got was a very enlightening experience that kind of answered some questions that had been in the back of my mind that had been growing out of my meditation practice. And it was at that point when a couple of things that he said to me launched me toward California. One of them was, "Go west, young man." And I think it was within a month I was headed out to California.
Right.
And when I landed in California, the first day I was there, I met people. I met people who would then be relative to me meeting Timothy Leary the next time, although I didn't even know it at that point. But my first encounter with John Lilly was at a party that I went to that I knew Timothy Leary was going to be at.
Okay.
And
so what year are we talking?
This would be probably in about 1979, in the late 70s.
Okay.
I moved to California in 1976, and this was somewhere in the late 70s. I'd been experimenting. Well, let me tell you a little bit about my background. When I was 13 years old, I had, that was about the time when the flower children were around,
right.
and
68,
LSD started coming about, and I heard about this as a kid, and
Where
I
were you
was
growing up?
fascinated. I was in South Florida.
Oh, okay.
On the east coast of the United States, and
Right.
I heard about this LSD stuff, and it sounded fascinating to me that people would ingest this and then see things that weren't there, hallucinate, and it just was intriguing to me. I'd always had an interest in psychology, but like most people who are interested in psychology, they're mostly interested in figuring themselves out.
Sure.
So that was kind of where I was coming from, but still I was drawn to this idea that there was another reality that you could experience,
right.
By taking some kind of substance. But at the same time, I had a kind of intuitive understanding that I wasn't going to do this as a recreational thing, in the sense of just partying. It was going to be more of a recreational thing in terms of recreating myself.
Right.
I didn't really understand what that meant. I just had a sense about it.
You'd not been brought up in a kind of religious background, at all?
Well, not really. I was raised a Protestant Presbyterian, but it wasn't until I was ready to leave the church that I even questioned what I was supposed to be believing as a Presbyterian. What makes us Presbyterian? I had no kind of
They didn't really
idea.
teach you religious studies very well.
Not really, and
Right.
especially not comparative things. I heard what the minister said, and he talked about Jesus, and but for me,
But he
it
didn't
was
talk
kind of
about
like
Buddha or anything, or Krishna. Like
no,
No.
and it was mostly like just a formula to. This is what you're going to do. This is what you should do. This is how you should live your life, and it was just generally a moral thing. And then becoming a teenager, it's going, wait a minute, I didn't pick this?
Right.
I'm going there because my parents brought me there. And one of the things I learned about Presbyterianism is that they believe in predestination. I had to ask what that was.
Right.
What is
Sure.
it? What is it that we believe? What does predestination mean? And do I believe that? So, it was about then that I said, well, this is silly.
Right.
This religion isn't coming from me.
It's like a partial
being
truth that's then distorted into a whole truth. Isn't
right,
it?
and it's been
Yeah.
imposed on me.
Right.
So I kind of left.
And
the
going
idea.
to California was kind of part of that, claiming your freedom.
Well, no, that was more when I was a teenager. Then I went to college. I was a pre-med major, or I was a pre-med program majoring in psychology.
Okay. Pre-med means you're about to train to be a doctor. If
Yes,
you want.
I'm in a track to go to medical school with
Right.
a major in psychology because I was intending to be a psychiatrist.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, how interesting.
And then when I met Timothy Leary and had that experience, I said, that's it, I'm going to California to make movies.
Oh, okay. So that was the professional thing.
Right.
Right.
So,
And just to finish responding to my question, you met John Lilly at that party.
well, I didn't quite meet him at that party. I had an encounter with him at that
Okay.
party. And I remember going to that party, and I wasn't able to speak to Tim much, but while milling around the party, I was actually walking along a path that was on a cliffside in Malibu.
Oh, wow.
And as I walked past these two kind of older gentlemen, and I was in my 20s, and I never partied with old people, and so it was kind of a weird feeling anyway. And then as I passed these two gentlemen, I heard one of them say to the other, or I heard somebody say, "We must be crazy, a couple of old acid heads like us standing so close to the edge of this cliff." And it was such a strange thing, and I turned around. One of them was staring right at me when he said it. And who are these guys? And coincidentally, I ended up getting a ride home to my neighborhood from an editor of High Times magazine.
Okay, yeah, I remember that thing.
And
Yeah.
and I asked him. I said, "Hey, who was that guy?" And I kind of described him. And he goes, "Oh, well, if it's the guy I'm thinking you're talking about, it was John Lilly, the dolphin guy." And
Right.
I don't know who that is. It ended up that I found out later that it was John Lilly and Albert Hoffman,
Oh, okay.
the man who had discovered the effects of LSD at Sandoz
Oh, Swiss guy.
Pharmaceutical.